Hey guys, I just wanted to let you know about this amazing new Match 3 game from the makers of Angry Birds called Small Town Murders. It has 2 million players already, and it is growing fast as the best mobile puzzle Match 3 game. And the best thing, it's free to play, and you get 5 free in-game boosters if you use my special link in the description. You can put your detective skills to the test with a free Small Town Murders crime scene mystery puzzle game. You become the investigator with thousands of new levels to choose from, and every crime being a puzzle. You get to uncover evidence, solve puzzle games, unlock clues, and narrow down the suspect list. Small Town Murders allows you to investigate crime scenes, solve murder mystery cases, solve matching puzzles to collect clues, and interrogate a cast of quirky characters such as Nora Mystery and Deputy Shanahan, all from the comfort of your own home. And to top that, there's a special promotion at the moment where every new user receives in-game boosters to help you solve those extra tricky puzzles. So if you're looking for a challenge, look no further. Download Small Town Murders from the description in the video and put your detective skills to the test. Small Town Murders is the perfect game to play whilst traveling home for Christmas. Why not get the whole family involved in the fun and see who can solve the mystery first? So what are you waiting for? Go to the video description, click on the special link, support the channel, and get 5 free in-game boosters and start your Small Town Murders adventure. Number 3. Tonya Ethridge McKinley. At about 5 a.m. on New Year's Day, 1985, a mother and daughter in Pensacola, Florida, were taking their dog to an old-night veterinarian. On the side of the road, they saw something odd. It turned out to be the dead body of a woman. They called the police. The dead woman had no identification on her. Fingerprints were taken, and it was determined that was the body of 23-year-old Tonya Ethridge McKinley. McKinley was the mother of an 18-month-old boy. When she was killed, she was a business student at a local community college. The medical examiner determined that she had only been dead for a few hours. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. The medical examiner could not determine what was used to strangle her. She had also been sexually assaulted. The police surmised that she was killed elsewhere and then dumped beside the road. The police did their best to retrace McKinley's steps before she was murdered. The night before her body was found, it was New Year's Eve, and McKinley had gone to a restaurant not far from where her body was found. She left the restaurant at around 1:30. It wasn't clear if she left with anyone or where she went afterward. The police also weren't sure when she encountered her killer. The police know that McKinley was killed sometime between 1:30 a.m. when she left the bar and 5 a.m. when her body was found. Unfortunately, there were too many unknowns surrounding the case. The police didn't know where McKinley was killed, what she was killed with, and most importantly, who killed her. It wasn't long before the case went cold. For 3 decades, investigators worked on the case. Leads would come in and they would be investigated, but they wouldn't lead anywhere. Then the investigators asked for assistance from Parabon Nanolabs, who was made famous for helping identify Joseph James DeAngelo as the notorious serial killer, the Golden State Killer. Parabon Nanolabs found a distant cousin of McKinley's killer. From there, investigators traced the killer's family tree. It led them to a suspect, 57-year-old Daniel Leonard Wells. Wells had lived in the Pensacola area for his entire life. When McKinley was murdered, he was 22 years old. The police began to follow Wells, and one day, they saw him toss a cigarette butt. They collected the cigarette butt and took his DNA from it. The DNA was a match to McKinley's killer's DNA. On March 18, 2020, 35 years after McKinley was killed, Wells was arrested. Daniel Wells had a criminal record. In 1987, he was arrested for battery and witness tampering. He pleaded guilty to battery, and the witness tampering charge was dropped. A year later, he was arrested for solicitation of prostitution. It's not clear what the outcome of that charge was. Wells' first appearance for the murder of Tonya Ethridge McKinley was set for April 8, 2020. But he didn't make it to that court appearance. In the early morning hours of April 2, 2020, 57-year-old Daniel Wells was found dead in his cell. He had hanged himself. The police have not released much information about Wells, like what he did for work or if he was married and had children. The police said they are sharing what information they do have about Wells with police departments in different counties. They think he may be responsible for other unsolved sex crimes. McKinley's son, who was 18 months old when she was murdered, said that Wells was a coward who didn't even wait for the trial. He said it's frustrating for our family on a lot of levels because we waited so long to get justice. Now it seems like we just have a lot more unanswered questions. Number 2. Anita Piteau. On March 14, 1968, 3 boys were in a farmer's field in Huntington Beach, California, and they came across the dead body of a woman. The police were called to the scene. The woman had suffered a horrible beating and her throat was slashed. She had also been sexually assaulted. She had only been dead for a few hours before she was found. The police were meticulous when it came to collecting and saving evidence from the crime scene. This included a cigarette butt that was found near her body. The woman did not have any identification on her. The police tried their best to identify the victim, but she did not match any missing persons reports. What was known was that she was white, she had brown hair, brown eyes, and she was in her mid-20s. Her dental health was poor, and she was missing several teeth. Since she couldn't be identified, she was buried as a Jane Doe in a cemetery in Huntington Beach. The police didn't have any better luck identifying the killer. It wasn't long before the case went cold. 3 decades went by, and then, in 2001, a DNA profile was created from a stain on the victim's clothes and the rape kit. Unfortunately, the male DNA did not match any known suspect. 10 years later, in 2001, a DNA profile was made from DNA pulled from the cigarette butt. It was a match to the male DNA found on the victim's clothes and the rape kit. Once again, it did not lead to a suspect. Blood found on the victim's blouse was tested at the same time, and it was determined that was the victim's blood. The victim's DNA profile was entered into a missing persons database, but no match was found. It looked like the victim was never going to be identified, and her murder would remain unsolved. Then came the innovative method of identifying people through family trees, known as forensic genealogy. In March 2020, with the help of Parabon Nanolabs, the police first identified the killer as Johnny Crisco. Crisco, who was 24 at the time of the murder, had not been a suspect in the case. The police investigated Crisco's background, but they only found incomplete records. What they found was disturbing. Crisco was known for his violent temper. His temper was the reason he was discharged from the Army in 1963. He originally joined the Army when he was 17 because he had been convicted of statutory rape. Crisco had also been accused of assault with a deadly weapon, spousal abuse, kidnapping, and child molestation. But the investigators never found out if he was ever convicted of these crimes. Johnny Crisco had suffered several losses of his own. In the early 1960s, his 20-day-old son died from intestinal infections. With the benefit of hindsight, the police suspect that Crisco may have done something that resulted in his son's death. In March 1972, Crisco was driving with his wife, his 10-year-old son, Johnny Jr., and his friend. Crisco took a turn too quickly and the car overturned. His 10-year-old son was killed in the accident. It was suspected that Crisco was drunk when the accident happened, but there are no records that he was charged in connection with the deadly crash. In 1986, Crisco moved from California to Kitsap County, Washington. He stayed for a short time and then moved back south. In 1990, he moved to West Bremerton, Washington. Throughout his life, Crisco held several jobs, including being a bouncer, a car mechanic, a cemetery worker, and a maintenance man at a cement factory. Crisco had been married 3 times. One woman who dated Crisco for 2.5 years said that he had threatened to kill her and her children. She ended up carrying a gun because she was so afraid of Crisco. Johnny Crisco lived out the rest of his life in West Bremerton. He died in 2015 at the age of 71 from throat cancer. So when his DNA was linked to the murder of the Jane Doe, it was too late for him to shed any light on the victim's identity or how he met her. The police then asked Colleen Fitzpatrick for help in identifying the victim. Fitzpatrick had been a rocket scientist, but she is now a genetic genealogist. She is the person who coined the term forensic genealogy. Within a week, Fitzpatrick found a relative of the victim. The relative gave Fitzpatrick the obituary of her cousin, Connie Saucier. Saucier's obituary listed her siblings, and it said that her sister, Anita Piteau, had been missing since 1970. Fitzpatrick knew there was a good chance that Piteau was the Jane Doe. Fitzpatrick managed to get a DNA sample from Piteau's immediate family. In June 2020, it was determined that the Jane Doe found in the field in Huntington Beach was Anita Piteau. Piteau was murdered 5 days after her 26th birthday. Piteau had lived in Augusta, Maine, with her parents and her 7 siblings. She had traveled to California just a few months before her murder to explore the area. She wrote to her family nearly every day. In her last letter, which she sent to her family in February 1968, she wrote that she had visited Hollywood and she went on a tour of stars' homes. She planned to return home in May. After the letters stopped, her family hired a private investigator to find her. But the private investigator was not able to determine what happened to her. Piteau's parents and several of her siblings have passed away in the decades since she went missing. In July 2020, her surviving family members had a memorial service for her. The police are not sure how Piteau and Crisco met. The police have speculated that they were on a date. Something went wrong and Crisco lost his temper. He ended up killing her and dumping her in the field. Both the killer and the victim were identified 52 years after the crime was committed. This makes it one of the oldest cold cases to be solved in American history. Number 1. Siobhan McGuinness. In the winter of 1974, 5-year-old Siobhan McGuinness lived with her family in a small house on a quiet street in Missoula, Montana. On the night of February 5th, 1974, Siobhan was visiting a friend. Her mother, Bonnie, talked to her on the phone at about 6:30 p.m. and told her to come home. A family friend walked Siobhan to a school that was about 3 blocks from her home. Siobhan then started to walk home alone. Sadly, she never arrived home. Bonnie reported Siobhan missing at about 8:45 p.m. Massive searches were conducted and many police officers worked double shifts. A problem that hampered the searches was that the area experienced heavy snowfall the morning after Siobhan went missing. 2 days after Siobhan vanished, her body was found. It had been stuffed in a culvert just outside the city limits. Some dogs had dragged her body from the culvert. Siobhan had been sexually assaulted, struck in the head, and stabbed multiple times in the chest. 2 witnesses reported seeing a car close to where the body was found. It was a green Cadillac with New York license plates. The driver was a young man, possibly in his early 20s, and he had curly red hair. Unfortunately, not much progress was made in the search for the killer. The case soon became colder than the winter night 5-year-old Siobhan McGuinness was murdered. Then, in the autumn of 2020, the police got a significant break in the case. In October, the police announced that, thanks to forensic genealogy, they had identified the killer. He was Richard William Davis. Davis was 32 years old at the time of the murder. By the time Davis was linked to the murder, it was too late for him to face justice. He had died at the age of 70 in 2012. Davis had not been considered a suspect in the case until his DNA was linked to the crime scene. That was because, at the time of the murder, he lived 2,000 miles away in Bath, New York. It is not known why he was in Missoula when he kidnapped and murdered Siobhan. What is known is that at the time of the murder, he owned a green Cadillac which had New York plates. He also resembled the description of the person seen driving the car. Richard Davis did not have a criminal record. However, Davis had been connected to the attempted kidnapping of an 8-year-old girl in Bath the year before Siobhan was killed. But he was never charged in connection with the crime. Richard Davis's obituary said that he was a born-again Christian. He was married and he had 1 son and 4 daughters. His only son had passed away sometime before he died. Davis was born and raised in Pennsylvania. For several years in the late 1960s, he lived in South Dakota. He was a missionary on a Sioux reservation and he worked as a miner. Before the end of the 1960s, he moved to Bath, New York, where he worked as a security guard at a winery. In the mid-1970s, he moved to Alaska and worked as a school bus driver. He moved back to Bath a year later. In the late 1970s, Davis relocated to North Little Rock, Arkansas, where he resided for about 10 years. Once again, he worked as a security guard. This time it was at a school for the deaf and the blind. He also volunteered at Big Brothers/Big Sisters. In the late 1980s, he moved to Cabot, Arkansas. In the early 2000s, he was a truck driver. Richard Davis lived in Cabot with his wife until his death in August 2012. The FBI believes that Richard Davis may have committed other crimes, and they are continuing to investigate him. After Davis's family was notified that he killed Siobhan, his family contacted Siobhan's family. Siobhan's half-sister, Anita McGuinness, said that she appreciated the Davis's family reaching out to them. She asked that people respect their privacy because they were going through their own tragedy. The McGuinness family said that they are happy to have closure on the case, even though it came nearly 47 years after Siobhan was taken from them. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you find cold cases interesting, you should check out our new podcast, Into the Killing. In every episode of Into the Killing, we examine cold cases that are solved, often decades after the crime was committed. We also discuss the history of forensic science. In our latest episode, we look at the history of fingerprinting and one of the coldest cases ever to be solved thanks to fingerprinting. You can find Into the Killing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.